Welcome to Fully Exposed, a podcast that explores the taboo and unconventional in an attempt to educate your ass. I'm your host, Jessica Beuker. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to a new and exciting episode of Fully Exposed. Today we're going to be talking about sex and relationships, particularly as they relate to the topics of kink and BDSM. Our lovely guest today is a writer and BDSM educator, as well as the subject of a new and exciting documentary called The Artist and the Pervert. Mollena Willams-Haas. Welcome,
Hello.
Mollena.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in.
Absolutely.
To start, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Oh, wow. That is the worst intro ever. Well, I was born in New York City in 1969.
Only the most interesting bits, of course.
I am here mostly to talk about this documentary, which is fascinating because it's about my kinky relationship with my husband/dominant. And that goes back to speaking about my background as a sexuality educator in kink and in alternative lifestyle stuff. Across the board in many, many different places, which goes back to my even discovering that I was someone who had the proclivities to want to be involved in kink and BDSM and all of that entails. And I don't know how much people know about what those acronyms mean, but I don't like to use a term that people might not know. So BDSM stands for bondage and discipline. And then if you slide the circle over one more, the D and the S stands for dominance and submission. And then if you slide over one more letter, the S and the M stands for sadism and masochism. And so that acronym encompasses all of those worlds of alternative sexuality,
right,
which was something that I had experimented with my whole life. Since my very first relationship in high school, we would tie each other up and spank each other because we were like, this is fun, this is great. But I was not aware that there was a more profound psychological aspect for me until I had a relationship with this man when I was in my early 20s. Mm-hmm. And we had what I can only call really incredibly rough sex with name calling and face slapping and stripping all the sheets off the bed and climbing the walls. And then the next morning I was like, I feel compelled to bring him breakfast. And I thought to myself, this is really odd. Like all I want to do is make sure that he's just happy and everything is great, because that was so wonderful. We had this really intense long distance relationship for a while. And I assumed at first that this was a result of this one chemical connection with this one person. Mm-hmm. And then over the next year or so, I realized, no, I think this is something that I want. And so this is my job to figure out how to feel that again. Right. And so then the next couple of decades became about exploring that and finding that and getting those needs met with various people and a lot of experimentation. Fast forwarding to finally meeting and marrying a really cool and awesome guy who's also an artist and a composer, and myself being a performer and someone who is involved in the artistic world since the age of 5. It really seemed like that was a perfect match for us on that level. And then the fact that he was 60 years old and starting his life yet again in a new country. He just moved to New York. Was really remarkable to me as someone who'd been doing this my whole life to have someone say, yeah, I have sacrificed a lot. I have waited a long time. I've had a lot of emotional journeys. And now in this stage of my life, I'm ready to take this leap. And so I said, okay, great. I will leap too. Why not?
Wow, that was amazing. An amazing summary. You actually, I'm glad you touched on that, because one of my questions was if you could kind of just explain what BDSM is, because you're right. I think people hear the acronyms and don't understand, or maybe to the level of how you described it as sliding over, and that it encompasses so many things. Yeah, I think that's really interesting.
I think basically the most inclusive definition for me is the best. Mm-hmm. And so my definition is anything that falls outside of standard missionary position, cisgender sex.
Yeah.
And so that can be anything. And the reason I want it to be more inclusive is because I want more people to see themselves as freaky outlaws, because that makes life a little bit better. Yeah. When you ask people, have you engaged in BDSM? Many people will say no. But if you say, have you ever spanked your partner's butt while you're having sex? pretty much everyone's like, well, yeah, or gotten their butt spanked while they're having sex. Have you ever had anyone pull your hair? Have you had anyone hold you down? Have you had anyone maybe put their hands around your throat in a sexy kind of way? So maybe it was a little bit tough to breathe for a second. And then you felt this spike of electricity. And so when you start to encompass those things, more people say yes.
Right.
And the more people who say yes, the more people are feeling that they can access different modes of sexuality and modes of expression that make them kinky, even if it's just for one night.
Mm-hmm. For sure. You brought up a really interesting point, which is almost like there's become a little bit of like a fear around the word itself. Mm-hmm. But when you really break it into those simplistic terms of, you know, do you enjoy this, or have you done this, or have you felt this? It's the answers become a lot more clear, and people go, oh, well, yeah, of course.
Yes.
But it's that word, I think, that makes people say like, oh, that's weird, or like, I'm not into that.
Right,
and it kind of like scares people away a little bit.
It does.
I like the fact that you're kind of trying to bridge those two and be like, well, no, I mean,
you're probably doing it. And it's the same thing for power exchange relationships. When you talk about the fact people say, oh, how could you be someone submissive? You're such a strong, independent person. My thing is, everyone submits to someone else, and everyone dominates someone else. Mm-hmm. And every relationship has both of those aspects within it.
For sure.
And if you think about the fact that you are submitting to someone at work, and you are maybe dominating someone at work, if you think about the fact that everyone in the military is submissive, they are definitely submitting to someone above them. Mm-hmm. Even at the very top, that person submits to the president at this point, unfortunately, but that's the way things are. And so if you would think of someone who's in the Marine Corps, and you would look at that person who has impeccable training and skills and is fierce as hell, and say, that's also what a submissive looks like. Because this person is submitting to the defense of their nation and their pride in the job well done. And that is a symbol of strength. And yet they are obedient to the rules, the regulations, and the orders of their officers. And so when you put it into that context, people think, oh, well, yeah, that's not weakness. That's actually strength.
Right.
And service is something that many people enjoy and really love doing. Public service is something that people aspire to do. You know, like, oh, I want to be a public servant. That's what politics are supposed to be doing, is serving the public. And every parent-child relationship has that aspect of dominance because you have to be the boss of them, but it's also service because you're taking care of them. And so that dynamic is present all over. And when you point it out to people who are not involved in kink, they'll come back to you a month later and go, oh my God, you messed with my head. Now I'm trying to figure out in every situation, like, wait, who's the top here? And I'm like, it's really true. Yeah. And the cool thing about doing it consensually and consciously is that in those situations, you can then take a deep breath and say, okay, this person thinks that they're on top here.
Yeah.
And I maybe don't feel like they should be. Now what do I do? How do I manage that situation? And so much of my life has been improved by being conscious about those choices and how and when I engage with folks in a way where I'm either asserting my power or I'm accepting that someone else has power over me.
Right. Wow. I want to go back a little bit. You mentioned in the beginning that it was something that you felt you were interested in for most of your life. You kind of always incorporated these types of elements into even your earlier relationships. Can you kind of remember or pinpoint when the first time that you felt you were like introduced or I guess discovered BDSM or this side of you? Like, was it very, very young? Like, you know, even as a child or like as a young teen? Like, when did you kind of feel that this was like a part of you?
I would say probably it wasn't until I was in my early 20s.
Okay.
Because I can go back and look and see signposts and markers and say, oh, this is indicative of a more submissive personality. Mm-hmm. This is where I can see where doing service for people was important. But that's sort of reverse engineering it for me.
Right.
The fact that my sexuality included it wasn't necessarily about the submission or about the dominance. It was about the fun excitement of bondage. I didn't really care that someone was dominating me. Mm-hmm. I cared that I was getting tied up and that was fun and someone was paying attention to me. So that was great. It was not until I was in my 20s, had this, affair with this guy that then continued on through a long distance relationship with letters and phone calls and all of that. And I started actually writing erotica for this person.
Oh, wow.
And it was just the dirtiest, most politically incorrect, evil, bad, terrible thing you could ever imagine. And I'm mailing these things to him, and I'm going, I'm just going to burn in hell. I'm going to burn in hell. If any Black person finds out that I'm having these fantasies of being like the poor slave girl, being abused by this evil white man, people are just going to like take away my Black card. And I felt horrible about it. But that fantasy, part of it was that it was so forbidden. Mm-hmm. And as so many people do, when studies are done about people's secret fantasies, the rape fantasy is one of the top two that so many people have. And it's not that people want to actually be abducted and sexually assaulted, but they want to have someone who they also find sexy overpower them. It's the idea of not having to be responsible for your own pleasure and your own agency and letting go. Mm-hmm. That's what the psychological root of that fantasy is. And so the idea that something as evil as non-consensual chattel level slavery can be somehow redirected into an erotic path is super dark, but it's also really real. If you talk to people who have really dark sexual fantasies, none of them want to live those in the reality of their life. Mm-hmm. It's an escapist sort of headspace that people like to think about. And so many people that I've spoken to over the years have these really deep fantasies. And when you go back and you look at them, it's something that popped up for you and then was squished down. Mm-hmm. You know, in one of those ways where I can go back and say, here was a moment where I can look back and say, oh, that was weird. As a kid, I was watching Star Trek. That was my jam all the time. And there's one episode where Captain Kirk, Uhura, and I think Chekhov are taken out of this planet, and they're forced to fight in this arena. And they're given these collars that light up and cause them extreme pain if they disobey. And Kirk is assigned to this sexy green-haired alien lady to fight with and train. And they have these collars, and I'm like, oh, that's actually kind of cool, but I didn't connect it with anything else.
Right.
And then there's another Star Trek episode, The Wrath of, the Space Seed, which became The Wrath of Khan later. And there's one scene where Ricardo Montalban and all of his stunning late 60s hotness is seducing this woman, and she basically, he asks her to betray the entire enterprise for him. And she's like, I can't do it. And so he pushes her away and she falls to the floor. It's very dramatic. And then he looks down on her and says, leave or stay, but do it because it's what you wish to do. Oh. And so she's like, I'll stay. And then he picks her up and like grabs her really rough and is like, I'm taking the ship and I'm taking you and blah, blah, blah. And I found this incredibly fascinating. I love the idea of having this strong figure grabbing you and taking you and all of these things. And then, of course, a couple years later, Roots is on television, and I'm watching people who look like me subject to the worst possible treatment that you could ever think of. And it was very difficult to watch, but also very important. And I was about 8 when Roots came on television. And I was raised in a pretty Christian household, and my mother had always taught us that all people were God's creatures and that there was good in everyone, et cetera. And so I'm watching this and I'm thinking, how could you be good and own human beings? That would seem to me to be automatically bad. And then I thought, because I'm a smart kid, well, maybe some people own slaves and were nice to them, and maybe so slavery wouldn't be that bad. So I had this conversation with my mom, you can imagine. And I was like, Mom, would it be okay to be a slave if the person who owned you treated you nicely? My mother's like, no, there is no, and she logically and completely justifiably explained in no uncertain terms that these things could never live side by side.
Right.
There was no way for you to have someone take away your humanity in that way and also have it be acceptable or good. And so that messaging early on was, okay, this type of power is always going to be bad, and it's always going to be visited on people like me. So that was very deep in my head. And so as I got a little bit older and I was in my 20s and starting to explore this, all I could look back on were these messages that, yes, that power was hot and sexy, but I could not have it because as a Black person, my history was so tormented and drawn down into some of the worst atrocities you could possibly think of.
Yeah.
And so how could I play at doing this? And so it wasn't an easy process. There was no one light bulb moment, really. There were series of instances where I had to accept that this was who I was. And then I had to figure out how to think, okay, I'm actually not a really fucked up, terrible person. I don't hate myself. I'm pretty happy with who I am. I actually think I'm a pretty cool person. And I want to be tied up and spanked. How do I resolve that? Mm-hmm. And one of the steps towards that I took was I was speaking to a friend of mine who was not Black and said, so basically you're telling me you can't do a thing because you're Black. Isn't that like what racism is exactly? And I was like, oh, you son of a bitch. Okay, fine. You make a point.
That's very interesting. You mentioned kind of something that popped into my head when you were talking about, these issues of like, the rape fantasies and the submissive fantasies. I think one thing that I guess people kind of miss about those as being, terrible tragedies that happen to people in real life, and those people wanting to kind of act on those things in the bedroom is there's this huge element, obviously, of like consent and communication, right? When those things are happening to you in the world by somebody that you don't know or you don't feel comfortable with, you have no autonomy in that situation. And so I think people kind of like miss that a little bit when they think like, because their mind just instantly goes to that it's a very like weak and disempowering thing, when in all reality, from what you've explained anyway, it seems like you maintain and hold a lot of autonomy in the situation, and there's clear cut communication and consent between you and your partner, and I think that's kind of what I guess people maybe miss in that equation.
I think people do miss it. It's part of the idea that people have that submission is weak and that dominance is bullying, and that dominance is about taking. But when you add in the completely necessary issue of consent, it has to be that all parties are consenting to what's going on, because the moment consent is withdrawn, it becomes abusive.
Right.
And that's the difference, is the intention. If someone on the street that I don't know walks up to me and spanks my butt, that is a completely different thing than someone I know who has said, hey, your butt's looking good today. Would you like me to spank it? And me saying, yes, I would. Thank you very much. And here's how I would like that done for maximum awesomeness.
Yeah.
Those are completely different issues. And the thing is that when you look at history and you look at how much horrible abuse has happened, having a scene or having a fetish or having a kink that mirrors that, however, is now done with consent, with consenting adults, with people who are negotiating from a place of power, because this is all power exchange, and the word exchange is used very deliberately, has to happen with people who are both possessed of autonomy and power and have the capacity to say yes and no. That's absolutely important. And you can have a room full of 100 perverts and ask them what kink is and get 180 different answers. But the one thing each and every person will say universally is 100% necessary all the time is consent.
Right.
And when I talk to people about even their darker fantasies and they say, well, I feel really badly about this, I said, well, you feel badly about it because in the context of a non-consensual situation, this is an atrocity. In the context of a consensual psychodrama or fantasy, it can become pleasurable. And it's difficult for people to hold that dichotomy in their heads. People really want it to be yes or no, black or white, good or evil. And I think a lot of the problem people have with me is I'm saying it is terrible, it is ugly, and it's erotic, and it's sexy.
Yeah.
You can't deny that. I had this conversation with folks because one of the more forbidden fantasies for lots of people is the idea of having, like a Nazi role play scenario where they have like the evil interrogator, like yelling at the prisoner and you're shaking and you think, how horrible is that? And I'm here to tell you that many people I know who have those fantasies have a background or history where these are atrocities that have occurred within their own family. Yeah. And it's not about saying, these things are okay. It's about saying these things are scary and I want to play with them. We build entire amusement parks to terrify ourselves. This is what we're doing when we have kink. We're terrifying ourselves in our heads and in our bedrooms. And that ride is one that you take with safety bars in place, so that you can walk away at the end of the day. That's part of the arousal curve for you.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about your current relationship, just because that's what the documentary focuses on.
About it.
There's an entire documentary about it. So I want to start from the beginning there as well and ask how you and your husband met.
On OkCupid, of all places.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he had moved to the U.S. and was on point for finding a kink relationship. This is what he had waited his whole life to find. And so he signed up for OkCupid and had a profile up. And I had spent many years with profiles on many different dating sites. And I actually worked for several years for the Adult Friend Finder empire, which ran dozens of dating websites, including Friend Finder, Adult Friend Finder,
oh my goodness,
alt.com, bondage.com. All those websites were run by them, and I did content work for them for several years. That was my desk job, which is the most hilarious desk job ever. It's the one place on earth where if you're watching a video of like some cat riding a Roomba and your boss walks by, you have to click dick, 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 dicks. I have dicks, just all dicks. No kittens here, just looking at dick. Because I have a dick deadline today. Like I got to find 10 of them that look pretty. Put them on the website.
That's hilarious.
And so that was my background. And so I'm very critical of people's responses to me, and I'm analyzing and I'm drilling down on 10 levels and reading between the lines with every message that I get. And he sent me a message actually the month that I was about to shut down my profile. It was the end of 2013. And I had gone through a lot of life crisis stuff, and I had been trying very hard to focus on making a living as a sex educator exclusively, and discovering that that's not a thing. And so I said, well, if I can be at the top of my game and literally traveling all over the world and doing this and still eating my savings away slowly, I'm going to have to do something else. And I decided, okay, 2014 is going to be the year. I'm going to take a deep breath, peel this way back, get myself a good corporate job and do the stuff, and et cetera. And so he sent me this message, I think, within the second week of December. So I was 2 weeks away from being like, go away, everyone, on this stupid website. And we had a date within maybe 4 or 5 days of him sending me this first message. And things escalated very quickly from there. And some of my friends were like, what are you doing? And I said, look, I'm in my 40s. This guy is 60. We have done this enough in our lives. And I would rather jump in and get in over my head and flop around and see how it goes than to try to sort of tiptoe into it cautiously and then figure out 3 years into the relationship that this is not where I want to be. Totally. Because I've done that. And I'm going to try this new thing. And the new thing is, great, yes, I'm going to be your submissive. We're going to sign a contract. We're going to do all the stuff. I'm going to move in with you. I'm going to travel around the world with you and do all the stuff you say and see how that goes. And 4.5 years later, and I'm like, it's not bad.
So if you, just to be very clear for our listeners, if you had to summarize your current relationship dynamic, what would you say that looks like?
I will say what it is, then I will say what it looks like.
Okay. Those are probably two different things.
They're so different. And it's really funny. But what it is that my purpose in our relationship is to make sure that his life is as awesome as possible. Okay. And I submit to him in terms of what he needs and what he wants. And the idea is that as his submissive and slave, which is a word I use judiciously, I'm a little bit sort of cautious about it because people have, of course, an assumption as to what that means. You have an image that jumps into your head when you hear the word. And I want to say, okay, yes, it's true. The ownership aspect of it is something that we acknowledge, but that's because we think it's sort of sexy. It's again about the psychodrama of him saying, you belong to me. And me saying, oh my gosh, that's fantastic. I love that. Great. Yay. And so there's a joy in it for us. And so on a day-to-day basis, that looks like me doing everything that needs to be done in order to make sure he is free to get his art done. So the sort of routine, mundane life, day-to-day things like getting up and getting a sandwich, he doesn't do. I'll do that for him. Interestingly, my resentment around that, which you might think, oh my God, sometimes get your own fucking sandwich. But the fact of the matter is, if he's working, when he's in his artistic headspace, he'll sit there for 12 hours and not eat. And so then my thing becomes, okay, sir, have you eaten? Oh, God, I'm going to get you a sandwich. Eat the sandwich. Eat it. Please just eat it, sir. Thank you very much. And so part of the joy in it for me is that I get to be who I am. It's not that I have to be this perfect, creeping, silent, weak, I use the term I have on my website that I'm the delicate, trembling flower of submission as this huge irony because someone tried to say that to me as an insult, to be like, oh yeah, you're clearly such a delicate flower. And I'm like, I fucking am, because I say I am. I'm delicate and trembling inside, but that's not the face I need to show the world.
Yeah. And
the face I show the world and what people see is they don't necessarily see that what I'm doing is for him. If they see me bossing him around, if we're backstage at a show and I'm like, sir, we need to go right now. No, you need to stop that conversation. Wrap it up, please. Sorry, excuse me, we need to go. And you might think, gosh, well, obviously she's the boss of him. But the fact is, he'll stand there and talk for an hour. And he needs to be somewhere else. So he has empowered me to say, I need for you to help me run my shit.
Right.
And I worked for years. When I worked in corporate America, I worked in banking for a while. And I was an executive assistant to an SVP, a senior vice president. And the thing is that I was the best admin he'd ever had because I did not give a shit about his title.
Yeah.
And I would walk into the office and he'd be in the middle of a meeting and I'd say, I need you to sign this, Peter. And it's like there'd be other people in the office like looking stunned, like I just came barging in. I'm like, no, I'm sorry. I've been waiting for this to be signed for like a week and now someone's breathing on my neck. Now it's my problem. Peter, sign the freaking thing. And he'd be like, sorry, Mo. And sign it. And then I'd walk out and I'd go on with my day. And people were like, whoa, what happened? I'm his employee.
Yeah.
I absolutely am dependent. At any moment, he could be like, you're fired and I'm out of here. However, he said to me, sometimes I forget stuff. He said, lean on me. If I'm not paying attention to you, please come after me. Yeah. And I was like, great. And so we had that agreement. And so that's how our relationship works, is that there are times when I need to shake him awake. And I mean, even in the documentary, you can see that a couple times where I'm like, get your shit together, calm down. Mm-hmm. And people sort of laugh at that. But I say, look, that's what works for us. That's the kind of person I am. I like to get shit done. And within the BDSM and leather community, you will often hear the joke, of people saying, well, who's really running the relationship? And it's obviously the person running it from the bottom. And in many relationships, in many situations, that's true, because a lot of people who are dominant have a grand plan or a grand scheme or a thing they want to do, but they can't necessarily accomplish it on their own. So they find someone who will throw their energy behind them. Right. And in the case of someone who is an artist, as an artist, myself, I appreciated that. Mm-hmm. And I had to sort of make the leap and say, wow, here I am giving all of my energy to this other person. What am I getting in return? Well, I get food, shelter, a place to live, a wonderful husband and a partner and a dominant and all those things. And then as our level of trust grew artistically, we became artistic cohorts as well. Mm-hmm. And have worked already together on one piece and have 4 more in the pipeline.
Oh, wow.
And so there's been this amazing shift where we've gone from my supporting his art to my supporting his art and our art. Yeah. And I don't think I would have ever gotten into that situation had I not been in this particular relationship with him in this format.
That's interesting. I wanted to talk about the benefits kind of, mm-hmm. of the relationship and about both sides. And of course, I was interested in what you see as, I guess, the greatest benefit of your relationship, but also I guess I never thought of it in terms of, which is so silly because that's what relationships are, but I was kind of thinking about it in terms of your benefits versus his benefits, as opposed to the benefits that you would have together, right? On as a couple and on an artistic level, which is really great. To just back up a little bit, can you talk a little bit about the communication, I guess, that took place to kind of get to where you guys are today? You said, mm-hmm. Before you could jump into signing a contract, how did that was it almost like a little bit of a negotiation, or what does that look like?
It's interesting because so many non-kinky folks don't do anything like what perverts do when it comes to negotiating our relationships. And it's sad. Like I kind of want to gain some notoriety just so I have a larger platform to say to the default world, do what we're doing, and I guarantee you will experience less non-consensual pain in your relationships. Because part of what are the things that's expected is for you to say up front, this is what I want. This is what's not acceptable. If X, Y, and Z occurs, I'm out of here. Everything is done, you know, even from the macro level of a scene where someone's saying, I'm going to put these handcuffs on you and spank you. It's like, okay, great. I want you to spank my butt in this particular way. If I have a problem, I will say this word and it's over. You take that to the next level of a relationship. And I say, okay, here's our relationship. This is the type of sex you want to have. Maybe this type of sex is sex that I will enjoy or not. If I'm not enjoying it, I need to check in with you and let you know. I am willing to provide service for you. I hate house cleaning. I do not want to scrub your toilets. I do not want to have to do this what to me is drudgery housework. And this was something that was such a universal part of me being a submissive in previous relationships. It's like, hey, welcome submissive, clean my house.
Right.
You know, it's this old joke. And Georg was like, oh, no, I want you to be my slave and my muse. I don't want you to be my housekeeper. We'll hire someone for that. And so that's in the contract, is that household work is to be done by someone who is brought in from outside. That is not my job. It's my job to make it happen. So I make sure to schedule the house cleaning. You know, I do not have to do the laundry. I do not have to do the ironing. I take that to the place on the corner, and there's a very nice lady who brings back his shirts looking fresh and clean. You know, that's my responsibility, is to make shit happen, not necessarily to do the day-to-day. And these were all things that we negotiated. And when I walked into his house, I'm like, great, you have a dishwasher, because I hate doing dishes. And I said, okay, great. You know, if we're flying somewhere, I want to make sure that if we're flying over a certain number of hours, that we make sure that we have at least, you know, upgraded seats and everything else. And these small details make it so that we don't have to have conflict over those things later.
Yeah.
And the idea of having those conversations at the beginning of a quote unquote vanilla relationship is alien to people. No one would think that it would be okay for you to walk into Starbucks on your first coffee date and say, hey, you know what? I need to be married and have kids in the next 8 or 9 years. So if this is not something that's cool for you, then that's great. I need sex 2 or 3 times a month at most. If you come at me any more than that, you're just going to aggravate me. So if you're like one of these people who needs to do it every other day, we're not going to be compatible with it. I have these 3 other former lovers who I still talk to. If you have a problem with that, that's going to be an issue. You would never have that be your first conversation off of a date, you know, that you met at an office party or online. But we kinky folks do that as a standard default thing, because that's how you get your needs met. And I would wish for all non-kinky people to have the capacity to advocate for themselves up front. Because that means that you're not finding this shit out 2 years into your relationships.
Yeah.
I know so many people who've had relationships where everything is great and everything is wonderful until they discover that the other person never ever wants to get married and thinks that marriage is bullshit. And this person just sort of assumed that they would get married if things worked out. That was a natural curve of things. And it doesn't necessarily occur to a lot of people to have those conversations. And what I'm telling people is, have them up front. And that was something that we did. We spent the first couple of weeks of our relationship talking exactly about those goals and what those things meant. And he, for example, had kids from his first marriage and then kids from a prior relationship. And he was like, I don't want you in any way, shape, or form, you know, interfering with my relationship with my kids. And I was like, absolutely, perfect boundary. I respect that. Thank you. I expect you to not interfere with my relationship with my family for what that's worth. I don't have kids, so I don't have the same thing. But if my family needs me, I need for you to step down and for our relationship to maybe, you know, take a side burner for a bit if there's a family emergency, if something's going on. And so we talked about those things as much as possible. And it's ongoing. So, you know, when we talk about what we spoke about in the beginning of the relationship, those things always shift and change to this day. Totally. Even. Right now we're in the midst of a sort of a negotiation about how to handle things when both of us are stressed. Because I'm really good about the caretaking thing. But if I'm stressed and then he's stressed, he's like, I need for you to be okay. Because if I'm not okay, then his world starts to unravel a little bit, which is a lot of pressure on me. And I'm like, I need for you to actually be okay right now because I'm not really okay. I'm stressed. I'm tired. I've been dealing with health issues for the past 4 months. I had an upper respiratory infection. I broke my ankle. My body's tired, you know, and sometimes I do just want to be like, get your own fucking sandwich, sir. You put sir on the end, it automatically adds all the levels of respect. It's all good. So what we have to do is to negotiate what being human looks like, you know, and he's 64 and I'm 48. And so as we get older together, hopefully, there's going to be other stuff that comes into play there as well. There's going to have to be adjustments made. And the good thing about the fact that we have had these hard discussions means that we are ready to take those things on. You know, I told him at one point when we were having a stressful moment, and I said to him, you know what, if things get really bad in this relationship, I will leave you. I'm going to go. I'm not going to stick around in an unhappy marriage.
Yeah.
And that sounds like the worst thing you could possibly say. But he was so relieved when I said that, because he'd had relationships where people stayed around because of the kids, because of obligations, because divorce was bad or whatever else. And I said, you are free to live your life and fuck up.
Yeah.
You know, and you are also free to know that I have enough respect for myself that I'm not going to hang around because I have a nice lifestyle, yet I'm emotionally unhappy. I said, so you have to keep your shit together. And he was like, okay, yeah, great. I can work with that, you know, and that's the beauty of honesty, is that I never have to be afraid of things going badly and me feeling trapped.
Yeah.
You know, that's very new. That's a very new dynamic, and it's fantastic. And that, for me, the way I achieved that was through this power dynamic.
Wow. I hope people listen to this and are like, it's the most important thing that they've ever learned, because I truly, it's very, very interesting and timely that you brought up. I like recently had a conversation with a friend where I was explaining to her how, you know, a person who has like a very high libido could never work with somebody who has a very low libido, you know, like a one a monther with a one a dayer.
Yeah.
No matter how much you love each other, like sometimes that's not enough, because you're constantly going to have this, this battle over, you know, who has to feel like they're giving up, you know, their needs or their desires. And I was like, that could be avoided if people had conversations. Sure. And one of the things that she had mentioned was, well, you know, like, but it's very early. Like, I don't want to scare him away. And it's this interesting thing that I think society has like taught us that communication isn't sexy, that it's like, oh, you'll scare people away if you bring up all of that in the beginning, or if you know, and it's like, but is that someone you want to be with anyway?
What are you scaring away? I think what that does, and this is what's very creepy, is you're going back to the idea that you have to entrap someone.
Exactly.
Is that you have to get them so emotionally invested that they don't care that their needs aren't being met. And that is a foolproof recipe for resentment.
Yeah.
Each and every time you're going to wind up with some degree of resentment on one or both sides. That's nuts.
Yeah.
I can't, oh my gosh. Don't do it, people. I'm like, listen to me. Have the conversation, girl.
Have the conversations. Go in, guns a-blazing.
Yeah, because the thing is that if that person is not going to be okay with it, let's say they decide, I love you, no, let's do this. I promise you at some point, you're going to be like laying in bed going, oh my God, do I really have to do this again? Or the other person going, oh my God, if I approach her, if I approach him, if I approach them for sex, am I now some sort of creepy predator because of my needs? Yeah. And it's going to be hard for the other person to feel accepted, for both of them. Yeah, it takes a toll. Because wanting to have sex once a month is normal. Wanting to have sex every day is normal. But let's find where we are with people who are like-minded. Yeah. And like libido, because that's important. I'm like, you know, and if you don't have the same lineup, then figure out how to get those needs met. Yeah. You have to. Otherwise, it's a bummer. Totally. I also liked what you said about, you know, these communications, like eliminating, enhancing pleasure for both parties, but like eliminating, I can't remember exactly the phrase you used, but something about just like the discomfort that we feel in our own relationships at times, which is something, again, that I think, and women especially, have been sort of trained to just like
you deal with it,
Yeah.
you know, like, if sex is bad sometimes, it's like, that's just being a woman. But it's like that, it's something it's so bizarre to me that we're just like so complacent with and willing to accept as just like a part of our unique womanly experience.
Oh, God.
Because, you know, I have, you know, a lot of friends who you know, have been on that side of not having their needs met and also being pushed too far.
Yeah.
And again, there's also on the kind of opposite, I guess, more intense spectrum is that there are often times, and this like feels really gross to say, but there are definitely people who have it in their mind that you can't be, you know, assaulted if you're in a relationship with somebody. And that's just 100% not true. There still needs to be consent. And I think people forget to like check in with one another on that because they think like, oh, once we're in a relationship, it's like, we're both consenting now because we're in a relationship,
right.
rather than having the ongoing conversation.
No, and it's interesting because in my power dynamic, part of our sexual thing is he has the opportunity to, I'm like, my body is yours, you can do what you want. And my thing is, I provide that as part of service. I don't make much differentiation between that and making dinner. That's just my thing. Now, do I get aroused? Of course. But there's sometimes I'm just like, I'm not really horny. However, he's like, yeah, let's do it. Because he's like, you're so hot. You're so sexy. I'm like, no, that's great. You're so, okay, fine. Eventually I'll catch up with him, but I'm not necessarily attaching the same romantic and sexy time feelings as someone else is, which to some people might sound really terrible. But again, it's the consent. We've agreed to that.
Yeah.
And if there's a point where I'm like, you know what? Not today, Satan. Not today. You need to go and like whack it off yourself or something. We need to work out some other system. And we do so because his main goal is to maintain our relationship. And by maintaining our relationship, it's important that all of us feel pretty good about ourselves as often as possible.
Right.
And so it's not as though I have to lie there if I'm like PMSing, I have 40 things to do, I got 3 phone calls to make, 8 emails to answer, and I just can't handle it. And at that point, it's my responsibility. Part of what I am to do as his submissive is to say, I am having an issue. I'm having a problem. It's one of the things that I learned early on in my lifetime as a sub. And actually, we had a name for it in my first house where I was training to be a kinky bottom. And we called it actually the Prime Directive, which goes back to the Star Trek thing, which is so hilarious. And I had to tell people, no, it's not about interfering in pre-warp cultures. But the Prime Directive basically states that it is the responsibility of the submissive or slave to protect the property, which is themselves, at all times, up to and including from the owner themselves. So what that means is the alpha and omega is how are you doing, which seems counterintuitive because you think, oh, if someone's a slave, then their first responsibility is to obey the master. It's like, well, no, your first responsibility is like when you're on an airplane and they're like, if those little cups drop down, put your mask on first. Yeah. And what this is saying is, as someone who is in service, I am now tasking you with self-care. So the most important thing you can do is make sure that your physical, emotional, spiritual, and sexual well-being are on point. And if that's falling off, you have to tell me. Right. And for me, this was liberating because I'm one of those people who will. I've been acculturated as a woman to like suck it up and grin and bear it. And the whole mythos of the strong Black woman weighs upon us very heavily, in addition to the standard sort of American woman, housewife, mother, career lady, everything else. On top of that, I have also within my own culture the idea that we are, you know, the rock and the foundation and all of that stuff. And so the idea of saying I'm falling apart was alien to me. And so even when I was falling apart, I took pride in never letting that show. And now it's my responsibility to say, I'm having a hard time, I need help. Yeah. And so that shifted my life and gave me the freedom to be vulnerable and to trust someone with that vulnerability. And that's where he, as the dominant and owner, has to take the responsibility for also accepting that I'm a vulnerable human being. Sometimes he's going to have to make his own sandwiches. Sometimes he's going to have to hold me up. Yeah. And he wants to take pride in that as the owner. He's like, today I'm going to be the guy. I'm going to be the strong one. And she's not feeling so great. But she is the love of my life, and this is what I do for her. And that being explicitly stated what that helps is on the days when everything is shit and you're just like, if I pushed you out of the window, could I get away with it? You take a breath and you think, no, this person loves me and they have committed to taking care of me. Maybe not right now is not their finest moment, but we have this agreement. And it helps me to breathe through that. And it helps him as well. And this is, again, something I definitely attribute to that conscious agreement to be in an active level of consent at all times. Because we have to remember, we're doing something that's a little bit unusual here. So we have to be conscious about it. The moment you start taking it for granted is the moment that resentment can start to build up. And I don't want to live that way. And neither does he.
We've talked a lot about the benefits for the both of you and mutually. I want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the challenges, I guess, that you faced in your relationship.
Some of the challenge is coming from our external challenges. Criticism that you get from other people is exhausting sometimes. Yeah. And I'd like to think that I'm strong enough to bear it and let the water roll off the back. And it's you, it's not me. But there's sometimes it pierces the armor. And it's difficult to have someone tell you that your relationship is fucked up and that you're obviously, mentally unwell and that you are just mirroring the patriarchy and have obviously come to a place where you have accepted a degenerate role in your degenerate relationship. So those things are very difficult. Internally, one of the challenges that we have is that, and Georg speaks about this actually in the documentary, is that he's coming from a history of physical and emotional abuse from his childhood. And he was raised by Nazi parents who were second generation.
Oh my goodness.
When he was younger, like in the mountains, literally, in Austria. And you watch The Sound of Music and you're like, I actually made him watch it. Sidebar, no Austrians watch this movie. They're like, and then you think about it, you're like, why would they?
Yeah.
And you think it's like, oh, it's pretty and it's hills and it's twirling. It's like, no. If your valley faces, north-south, for example, you don't see the sun rise or set ever. So you can imagine that mountains are the limit of your world. And your parents are your world. And his parents are, he was born in 1953. So you got to think about what was happening in the world for Austria at that point.
Wow.
And they never had to sort of say, we're sorry about all the fucked up shit that we did. Austria sort of just went back to normal. So all these people who had committed all these crimes and committed all these atrocities were the teachers and the landlords and the locksmiths and the bakers and the butchers. They just went back to their lives. And that was the world in which he was brought up. And his parents were very heavy-handed with physical abuse. So he has a lot of the things that happen to you when you are emotionally and psychologically abused as a kid. And some of those things are difficult to cope with.
Yeah.
Anxiety and lashing out when you're upset because you don't know how to handle your communication skills. And the saving grace for those things have been that he wants to be happier. He wants to have a better life. And so the first couple of years of our relationship were difficult in this way when he would have an emotional crisis, because his way of coping with it was, to me, not acceptable. I was like, you can't lash out at me. You can lash out in general, but you can't come for me because I'm on your side.
Yeah. And
I know you have not really felt that way before in a relationship. There's always been some sort of adversarial aspect to it. But I said, my goal here is to be as part of you as your right hand in my service to you. And so you can't decide you're just going to suddenly chop me off. It's not good for anyone.
Yeah.
So those things were very, very difficult. I'm very used to autonomy and used to doing my own thing. And he, for example, as a composer, lives in silence because he's working all the time. And so something as small as not being able to crank up my stereo just to zone out when I want to this day, this morning we're traveling and he actually had to fly back to New York.
Oh, okay.
For the day. And I have this very high-tech speaker that I can pack into my bag. So when he's out of the hotel room, I crank it up and I'm in the shower I'm like singing Duran Duran in the shower, and I was like, oh, this feels so good. Oh, I miss normal music. Because there's something different. Like, I can listen to it on my headphones all the time, but there's something different about just having ambient music in your house.
Yeah, fill your space.
Yeah, and I don't get that very often unless he's away, in which case I'm like, then it becomes sort of like my secret life. Like, oh yes, he's out of the house. Now I can listen to Tupac cranked up. And I'm sure the neighbors are like, what is going on in that house? It's dead silent for 12 days straight. And then it's like Tupac and Biggie and Duran Duran and like Sarah Vaughan. And they're just like, what's happening? So there were, and on the one hand, it seemed like this huge sacrifice to have to make. I'm like, I have to adjust like the whole way that I live in some ways. But the other side of that is that he feels free to explore and to do his work in the best way he can. And his productivity, he tells people he produces 30% more than he ever could before our relationship.
Wow.
And so that's a couple of extra pieces a year for him because he's already pretty prolific. And so I can say, great, I've earned my salary for this year. So finding ways around those emotional kinds of difficulties, like I said, and we have like the usual kind of clashes that couples have. I'm just like, I wish you would do X, Y, and Z. But because I fetishize the service, I can say, God damn it, I wish he would pick up his fucking socks. However, am I not the best slave ever because I just like take a deep breath and pick up the socks and do the housework. And at the end of the day, he's like, thank you, darling. The house is amazing and everything is great. And you are so special and so wonderful and I love you. Aww. And I appreciate everything that you do. And I get that like 8-10 times a day.
Wow.
And so that helps to alleviate the times when I'm just like, I want to push you out of the window. Yeah. And I'm sure for him, I mean, he gets frustrated as well. It's the same stuff that happens in any couple. The difference being that for the first time, I feel like I have permission to say whatever is on my mind, as long as it's said from a place of love and knowing that I'm saying this because I want it to be better. You know, if he's having an anxiety and he's not communicating well, especially because if he gets like really tense and really like jacked up, now he's thinking in German again. And that's not the language you want people thinking in. I mean, to tell you right now, when they're upset, like, because I can see him like start to struggle with language. I'm like, oh no. Okay, take a deep breath. It's cool. Just explain what you're trying to say. You don't have to translate it directly. But what's great about that is that he's built that awareness and can see, okay, we're spiraling back down into that place where we're not communicating well. And both of us have that at the top of our agenda. And yeah, like that's, I would say that the overcoming our own past has been the height of the part that's difficult to overcome. You know, those are where we have the friction moments, you know. Yeah. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I have terrible self-esteem. You know, I don't ever feel good about myself about anything. And I can pretend like I do because I have to get through the day. But at the core, I'm like I'm sitting watching this documentary. I'm like, why do you care? You know, I'm watching this and going, I don't care. And a friend of mine actually nailed it. She said, you would love this if it was someone else. She goes, this was anyone else in the world, you would love this documentary. And I was like, oh, you're making me cry because you're so right. I would. I would think this was amazing that these folks did this. Yeah. You know, and had the guts to share that. Because, you know, I mean, both of us are like pudgy middle-aged folks just doing our little goofy lives. And we're not who you see. Yeah. You know, elevated to, even on like reality TV, you know, except for like disastrous train wrecks like Honey Boo Boo. But, you know, even when you have like the Kardashians, it's like everyone's beautiful, everyone's made up, everyone's slender and has a perfect butt, you know, as opposed to us. And I'm just sort of like, I guess this is good. I guess maybe this, you know, was fine. This is real life. Yeah. So, yeah. I think that what's so valuable about it is that there's so much to take from it, even for people who are not in your exact same situation or relationship dynamic. And one thing that when you were talking, I thought of is it's very interesting that people sort of have this like disdain for like submissive, you know, and kind of like relationships where there's like, you know, a master and a slave or whatever terms you want to call it.
because I mean, traditionally, that's like that's kind of how women and men were socialized,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
In the household, it was, the man kind of got to chase his dreams, and the wife was there to cook and clean and provide whatever services she needed to do for him to thrive.
Exactly.
But what's interesting about your relationship is, and why I don't fully understand, why people would look at it as necessarily a negative thing, is because there seems to be, it's almost like a reinvention of that dynamic in the sense that now you both are benefiting, but also, when you said that, your husband, you get those compliments and those kind of like words of encouragement, like 9 or 10 times a day, there's a lot of appreciation there. And 100%. I think that's kind of what was missing from those, kind of traditional like housewife worker dynamics.
This is exactly it. There's a huge difference between the assumption that this is a woman's role. Like the surrendered wife thing, right? Where it's like, oh, as a woman, it says in the Bible that I am to, be under the hand of the man.
Right.
And I'm like, this has nothing to do with my gender or my social role. This has to do with going deeper into who I am. Before, pre-gender, pre-socialization, who I am is someone who enjoys doing for other people, period. Yeah. How can I do that in a way where it's safe? It's very easy for people who are pleasers to be abused and to be used terribly by people who are takers. Versus Georg, who is a taker, and me, who is a giver, saying, you're going to take it, and I'm going to say, yes, I'm giving it to you, and you're going to appreciate it. And you're going to say, I am so fortunate that I get to live this life thanks to you. Yeah. And that is very different than someone making the assumption that you are their property because you're a woman. Yeah. Because you as a man have a right to have this. And it really excludes the fact that our gender configuration is what it is, but there are people all over every gender spectrum doing the exact same power exchange relationships in different formats. And you can't say that master-slave relationships are terrible and look at ours, because now you've excluded everyone else who doesn't look like us, who is not like a cisgender female and a cisgender male involved in a relationship. Yeah. Because all the rest of them, and I would say actually probably we're not the majority at this point in time. I think so many people who are exploring this or exploring this in many other configurations, you can't discount them. So if you're saying MS is bad, I'm like, well, but what about the people who aren't falling into that paradigm? Are they okay, but we're not? Yeah. So now you're saying that because of my identity, I am not allowed to experience this thing that is organic to me and doesn't just feel good, but is good. You can look at my life and you can dig as deep as you want, and you're not going to find very many dark secrets, if any at all. I can't even think of any. I'm terrible at keeping secrets. Like, oh my God, I suck. Other people's secrets, I can keep. My secrets, I suck at it. Absolutely terrible. And this is part of the reason why we said yes to do this documentary, despite the fact that it was really scary, is because both of us really love teaching. Georg has been a teacher and a professor for most of his career. In addition to being a composer, he's always taught. And so he sees this as a different modality for teaching. One of the things he says over and over again is, don't wait until you're 60 to go and explore your life. Try to not be afraid, or if you are afraid, say, I'm afraid, and do it anyway, because that would lead to more joy and more authenticity. And this is something that he is very much engaged in trying to convey. And so that's part of the reason that we just said yes. And I'm like, oh, I'm already out. I guess this will be fine.
I want to get a little political. Obviously, you've already expressed that, you have these kind of external pressures and challenges. And from the outside looking in, I'm sure that there are a lot of people who are very, very quick to criticize your relationship, probably before they really even meet you or know you. Obviously, it's not, there's not just kind of a feminist issue at play. There's also issues of race, and there's kind of all of these different intersections. I'm curious to know how you navigate those critiques and how you go about kind of having these conversations in the public sphere with people who maybe are so kind of quick to just jump down your throat. Yeah.
I actually don't engage. One of the things that I do when people hit the criticism is I accept it.
Oh,
if someone's like, that's really fucked up, I will say yes.
Wow. I guess like once you just go yes, it's like, what can they say?
Right. It's at that point that like you can keep yelling and I'm going to say, you're right. It is fucked up. It is hard. It doesn't look good. Sometimes it's going to look kind of ugly. I said, but isn't that true for so much of life?
Yeah.
And I tell people, I'm like, I'm not here to change your mind. I'm not here for you.
Yeah.
I'm not here for the people who think that a Black woman wearing a collar and running around is okay.
Yeah.
You know, so who don't think that a Black woman wearing a collar. I'm not here for them. I'm here for the people who are saying, I have felt different and I have been guilty and I have been struggling with this, and who see me and think, wait, maybe I am okay. Those are the people I'm here for. So the folks who are like yelling and screaming and throwing things or ready to dismiss me or ready to write these huge screeds about how fucked up I am, not here for them. And I actually, after the first few years of this, when I was first doing this, and I had people come up to my face. So you can say anything on the internet. I'm like, look, people who've dealt with internet haters is one thing. To have people who were your friends say, you need help because you're damaged and you really need to figure out a way to get your shit together because you're going down a road that's leading you in a bad direction. Like sitting across during coffee, you know?
Goodness.
And so once that has happened to you, you're sort of just like, okay, wow, I cried over that for months. There was, when I first got involved in kink, there were not a lot of women of color at all. And so when I started to meet other women of color, and then I would start talking about any sort of kink that involved actively dealing with racial issues, and they were not only uncomfortable with it, which I accept, but they felt that my talking about it was harming them as well. Because they were like, if you talk about it, then white people are going to think it's okay to do race play, and then they're going to come after me wanting to do some sort of like fucked up shit. And I said, well, look, okay, here's the thing. Let's say someone does that. Don't you think that now they've done you a favor by revealing that they don't have their act together? Like, wouldn't you rather know if someone is fetishizing you as an African-American woman, find that out quickly.
Yeah.
Get that out there as fast as possible. But people didn't disagree with me. And so because, I mean, I'm a fucking actor, so of course I need everyone to love me all the time. That's been my life since I was like 5 years old. And so the first few years I dealt with this, I struggled like a motherfucker because I was like, I need you to love me and understand who I am. I'm not a bad person. Please let me tell you why.
Yeah.
And the thing is that those folks were not going to ever be convinced. And once I realized that, I said, okay, who am I messaging? Who am I packaging this for? First, it's for me. I need to feel good about my life. Then it's for people who maybe are also having this struggle. There were not very many people talking about the issues of what it was like to be a submissive and to also be a Black woman. When I first came in the scene, there were 2 or 3 other people that I could find nationally.
Wow.
And so I said, well, I'm here now, so I need to be the 3rd or 4th.
Yeah.
You know, and now there are many more of us. And that's because now we have visibility. Now we have some traction. And so when people come to me and they're like, you're fucked up, this fuck up, I'm like, yes, you're right. Absolutely. Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
And then I have to move on because that energy diverted to someone whose mind is probably not going to be changed is better spent directing it towards someone who's questioning or who's saying, this confuses me. Can you tell me some more? Or I don't get it. Like someone who's like, I don't get it. I'll have that conversation because then I can process my own self, right? And I'm like, and I'm also working on my process. I'm like, hey, you don't get it. Well, why do I do it? Why am I doing it today? What the hell? And so I can have those conversations, and that's where I focus my energy because I don't want to focus my energy on the haters. As comedian Cat Williams has said, and I love quoting this, he's like, haters are going to hate. Let those motherfuckers do their job. That's what they're here for. Yeah. I was just like, I'm like, you proceed, hater. Like, you are here to just lay out that aggressive thing. It has less to do with me than it has to do with their opinion of me. And I can't live for that. Why?
Yeah. I think, and I mean, part of the reason that, you know, I do the show and I choose to talk about, quote unquote taboo topics or, unconventional lifestyles is I've kind of always had this idea that essentially hate just stems from ignorance. And I don't believe that, if people could actually have this conversation that we're having and hear, actually just sit and shut up and like not have to talk over you and listen to your side, that any person could come out of this not going like, okay. And not that they necessarily need to agree with you all of the time or want to choose to live their life that way, but at least be able to say, I get it, and I can respect that. Live your life how you're going to live your life. And so that's why I'm very excited about this documentary, and I really hope that people will watch it because, again, it's if it's if they want to choose to shut it off, then I guess that's their prerogative. Right. But it's there. And I find that a lot of times, too, when people are uncomfortable about something or they have questions or they're, scared for whatever reason, they have trouble kind of addressing those things face to face. So I think this type of education and this documentary is important in the fact that it allows people to do it, I guess, on their own time. Right. I mean, they can curl up in the corner of their room and watch it at midnight.
Like no one's confronting them. No one's coming in their face. No one's judging them if they agree or disagree.
Yeah.
And I understand it. Part of the issue of being like a Black person in America is that you have this fear that everything you do reflects on every other Black person in America. Yeah. Because to some extent it feels like that. And to some extent it is like that. You can ask any Black person, and I had this conversation on Facebook, like some crazy shit comes across your news feed. And I'm like, what's the first thing you think? And you're like, please don't let it be a Black person. Please, God. And then you're like, whew, okay, it's a white guy. Oh, thank God. Okay, cool. And you can move on. Because there's that sense that like it's just one more stick of wood that's on the pile of like, this is why they are terrible and evil and fucked up. Yeah. And so I understand that like no one wants to have added to their pile some sort of freaky sexual deviance. And part of what I'm saying is we're already here. Mm-hmm. You just don't know it yet. Yeah. Because if I could just anecdotally talk about the number of people over the years who are leading standard default lifestyles, who are doing kinky shit, it's over 60%. Yeah. I did my solo show when I was living in San Francisco and working for Wells Fargo Bank. I can say it now because the statute of limitations is expired. And I did my solo show and a bunch of my coworkers came. And these are bank people. Yeah. And I'm talking about kink and I'm like running around naked and I'm talking about getting my ass beaten and blah, 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 blah. And then over the next month at work, out of those 20 people, 6 of them came up to me like at the coffee machine and were like, yeah, so when you were talking about going to that sex club, the Power Exchange, my husband and I went there.
Oh my goodness.
And I was like, oh really? How was that? And she was like, no. I said, she said, no. We didn't do anything. We just went to look. And I was like, oh, cool. And then she goes, and we got home and we had the best sex we had ever had. And here's the thing. For this suburban couple, this was like a high point. It was delightful for them. Yeah. And so they related to what I had to say. And I had so many more of these little conversations like that where someone was like, oh, yeah, I really love getting bitten. Like while I'm having an orgasm, and I thought I was just some sort of weirdo. And she goes, no, I know there's people like who go and like, I'm like, oh girl, we got biting classes. We can have someone teach you like where it's good to bite, where it's less good to bite, how to bite with and leave less marks, blah, blah. And so what was really great to me was realizing that there's so many people who feel like they have this dirty, dark secret. And okay, if you love the dirty, dark secret, that turns some people on. I don't want to ruin your thing if you're like, yeah, I have a dirty, nasty secret. Wah. But I think for a lot of people feeling like they are not some sort of fucked up, drooling, cackling pervert, that it's like, look, what you're doing is fine. And as long as you're doing it with the consent of the person or people you're doing it with, that's it. It's great. And it relieves so much of that anxiety. You can feel like a pervert, you can feel dirty, but feeling anxious about it is where it's bad. Mm-hmm. I hope that makes sense. Because there's a difference to me between like feeling naughty and being anxious about it. The anxiety and the guilt is from outside. Yeah. That's someone else telling you that what you're doing is bad. Right. Babies play with themselves in the crib. They got their hands in the diaper nonstop. No one's told them that should feel good. They figured it out. Mm-hmm. And then we spend the rest of our lives smacking kids' hands away from, places that they should touch and get to know.
Yeah.
And that's terrible. And it's like, no, put your hands down there. That's my message to everyone. Put your hands down there. Do your thing.
I love that.
Check in.
I'm gonna get it on a t-shirt. Just put your hands down there. Finally, and most importantly, where can people watch the documentary?
This is an excellent question. Right now, it's in the process of just coming out. We just had the North American premiere.
Amazing.
And so they are looking for the distribution deal. So it's going to be a little bit, I think, before we know where it's going to be widespread. And the way that festivals work is it's sort of like they submit the film to like 50 different places, and then suddenly someone's like, great, you're in, and we're showing it right now. So the best thing to do would probably be to go to, I think it's artistandpervert.com, and see where the next announcement is. Okay. And the second they have a distribution deal, I'm hoping that it's like it winds up on like Amazon or on Netflix or both, so that people can just sit there, like you said, in the comfort of their own homes and click on it and have their own epiphany, or just point and laugh, like whatever it takes to bring them some pleasure. But I think it's going to be a remarkable journey for this film.
I hope so. That's amazing. I will put all of the links to the website and anything in the show notes. So if you're interested in seeing this film, which I highly suggest that you do, go there and click and find out when it's going to be available to you. Thank you so much for
Thank you for having me. It was a great combo.
It's a great combo. I've learned so many things and I feel enlightened. So thank you. That's our show. Thanks for tuning in this week to Fully Exposed. I hope your ass has been sufficiently educated.
This has been an Evoke Media podcast.